Today we're going to talk about the universal challenge that we've all been through of having to put Josh Truax into a cockpit. So I've been doing this for 15 years, I think, and I realized I just have a ludicrous number of scenes where I put Josh Truax into a cockpit, and I thought today could be fun to just go through and break down some stuff and maybe, I don't know, do a basic kind of tutorial at the end, see what's been learned. So let's start with Project London. Project London is a film that I wrote and directed back in 2007 and then spent like 7 years doing post on with Spiral Productions. And it's of note specifically because it's the only time we filmed in an actual cockpit. We had an actual Choctaw helicopter that we were able to film in, which made a huge difference. And I'm actually really jealous of past Ian getting to do that because it's so fun to have this actual textural place to film in there. Unfortunately, we filmed all of the cockpit scenes fairly static, and so they all have this kind of green screeny feeling to them where it feels like it's just, you know, a background placed behind some green screen footage, because that's exactly what happened. At times we had the camera on a boom so we could kind of move it appropriately, like you can see here, which adds quite a bit, but it still wasn't quite enough. It still feels very, very locked off. But this thing was so cool. Like, just, I mean, look at the window frames here and like the glass with the caulking around it and like the different scrapes and stuff. It's all so textural. We just got it all there in camera. It was very fun.
Can't this lifter go any faster? Oh, parking brake.
Also, you got into the cockpit by using like the seat itself as a hatch. Like, you'd push up on the seat, climb up, and then put it back down and sit on it, which I just thought was ridiculously cool. But yeah, I would love to at some point have an actual physical ship to shoot in again. I feel like we didn't really do it justice. I mean, we did okay given that it was 2007, but there's moments where you can kind of see the potential. And like Dolph made this really good 3D model of the ship, modeled off of the helicopter, and so we were able to blend the two together in a way which I still think is really, really cool. Yeah, and the original model used to render with Blender's internal renderer, but then somebody updated it to work with Cycles. But it's always interesting to go back and open old project files, just because like any second of rendering here would have taken like 8 minutes to render back in the day. And we actually rented a helicopter and flew all over Seattle filming everything, which is kind of fun, just in that everything in this shot is a photographed element, which is a thing I've never done since then. Although because I am just mixing and matching the two video layers, you can see they don't always match up. Like, I am tracking the background footage to this ship, so it's getting some of that camera motion to it, but there's still a little bit of drift. But yeah, this movie just has oodles of green screen cockpit action, and it's interesting to see how many instincts I had back then that are still kind of in play. The hardest thing with green screen scenes, as I say all the time, is making it not look as if it's just an element on top of a CG background, and so sandwiching it in between other layers. Like here I have a CG seat, then a green screened element, then this CG console, then the holographic element in the windshield, and then a background in the back. And having all those different layers really does help break up that kind of green screen feeling. This is actually from Pickup Shoot, which I kind of like. When you're working on a scene with a lot of post, you're dealing with the same footage for sometimes months at a time, and you just get to thinking like, oh, if I could shoot it again, I would have done all of these things kind of like differently and more interesting. And so this was a chance to actually kind of implement some of those. The first round of shoots we did looked more like this, where it's like, you know, it works, but it's very flat and straight on and kind of 2D.
Sole control of beam satellite has been given to Dominic in Force Lifter 5.
Denied.
Too late, sir.
Denied!
I can't!
But yeah, the weird thing is looking back 13, 14 years and seeing how many of my instincts way back then still kind of match what I would do today. Like, I don't know, I think I just would have assumed that my sensibilities about how spaceships should move and how that should be filmed and all of that would have changed a little bit more in the past, like, 13, 14 years, but nope. I think all of the cockpit stuff for the finale here was a pickup shoot, which we did because we realized we just needed to have a little bit more punch to stuff. In fact, I think Nathan Vegdahl and I planned out the entire fight scene in my backyard, and then we went and redid the pickup shoot, and then Nathan, this is the first time I'd ever worked with him, back in like 2008, animated like all of the good shots of this, and Nate Taylor did a few really good ones too. It's kind of fun because it's actually an arc. He'd never like piloted the robot before, and so you can see him like be really bad at it, and he slowly gets better. I was just 18 and had just seen Neon Genesis Evangelion, so I was like, there has to be like a dad that makes his son get in a big robot. This is the first time I ever did that kind of green screen fake out, where Josh is just sitting on a stool, you know, spinning in front of a green screen, and I'm pretending it's the camera orbiting around him. But you will notice in all of the cockpit shots, it's an actual animated 3D render. I parented the entire cockpit to an empty, and it's kind of orbiting around him. Like, Josh is a static element, so I had to rotate the entire cockpit to kind of like match what the big robot would be doing. Which leads me to the biggest difference between how I worked back then and how I work now. Like, I used to import a reference frame, or maybe even like a reference video, to line up the camera here, and then I would render this out without the person, so then I could, lay that in as the background in After Effects and key the person back on top, which meant I was fairly limited in what I could do. Like, I could still do a little bit of extra character animation as long as it was orbiting around where the character was sitting, but because the green screen character was locked in the frame and didn't actually know what the digital camera was doing, I couldn't do, anything wacky like adding camera shake or anything like that. Which is why I absolutely love having the pre-keyed character here on a card in the scene, because it means you can animate the camera doing whatever you want. You still kind of want to stay along the same axis as it was originally filmed from, for obvious reasons. But stuff like this, like compositing it in with behind the plexiglass and all of that, that would be really tricky. And you can incorporate haze and do all of this stuff that would be really hard if you're just trying to drop it on top of the CG, in the composite. And I'm also just able to add a lot more camera shake and stuff when it's appropriate, and just dial things in a lot more once I actually know what the scene is going to look like. Like, at one point, I just got a bunch of different shots of Josh doing different things and pretending to react to different scenarios and stuff, because I didn't exactly know how the edit was gonna turn out, and I still don't. But it's really fun to be able to kind of stew on it and tweak stuff and massage things around. Also, this is still very funny to me. Nathan did a great job animating this. Oh no. I was really proud of the detail of you can actually see like the robot's arms outside the cockpit echoing what he's doing with like a 3-second delay. I still think that works pretty well. And here's me trying to do that kind of like fake out orbit thing again, which it works okay.
Thanks, Jerry.
I'm really not that fond of pancakes.
These are crepes.
And at this point, you're probably wondering, Ian, why is all of this footage so jittery and stuttery and making me so miserable? And the answer is because of something called interlacing. And for your sake, I hope you don't know what I mean when I say interlacing, but for my sake, I'm going to tell you anyways. We filmed Project London in 2007, which was right before a big turning point, right before like red cameras entered the scene, right before DSLRs, and entered the picture. Back then, if you wanted to shoot in HD, 1920 by 1080, you had to basically use broadcast quality stuff. And the broadcast industry had been working for decades with equipment designed to work in conjunction with the electrical power grid, which in the US vibrates at 60 hertz, 60 times per second. It will change direction. And so like lights plugged into the power grid, like fluorescent lights, will actually flicker at 60 times per second or 30 times per second. I don't know. And so they went, okay, well, if we shoot at a multiple of that, at like 30 times per second, then we're shooting in the same rate as the vibrations, and I don't know. For whatever reason, it just works better. So television shooting at 30 frames per second. Film had been shooting at 24 frames per second since the 1920s. That had long been established, which means 30 frames per second just read as cheap to a lot of people. As an aside, most of the rest of the world has an electric grid that operates at 50 hertz, 50 vibrations per second, a multiple of which is 25, which means if you get a video camera from the UK, it will natively shoot video in 25 frames per second, which is much closer to the cinematic standard of 24 frames per second, which means I was always very jealous of those people whose video cameras looked intrinsically slightly more cinematic than the North American ones. The degree to which getting the cinematic look out of these old like late 90s, early 2000s video cameras was like a major goal of these super low budget filmmakers cannot be overstated. We're taking this like super low res footage, we're adding black bars, we're doing these weird S-curve grades and stuff on it. It was a madhouse. But in their dark hubris, they decided to push things one step further, because these broadcasts were being shown on old CRT televisions, cathode ray tube vacuum televisions, where they'd have like a little gamma gun firing line by line every piece of the image from top to bottom onto the back of this phosphor screen, which would kind of like hold on to this afterglow, and then your eyes, persistence of vision, would also like see frame after frame. The only problem was, by the time it got to the very bottom of the screen, you were starting to perceive kind of this rolling flicker, this kind of stutter. So they decided, okay, we will half the vertical resolution. We'll only project every other line so that we can actually project twice as many frames per second, which means the phosphor glow and the persistence of vision or whatever will have a lot less to try to deal with, and we get twice as many many frames per second. We get 60 frames per second of half the resolution. And it is into this insane carnival that we walk in saying, okay, but we only want to shoot, 24 frames per second, like a movie. And they go, okay, well, we can do that because we've got 60 half-resolution fields, they'd call them here. So we'll store the first frame on 2 fields, and we'll store, like, the second frame on maybe 3 fields, and we'll store the third frame on the next 3 fields, interlacing. It was absolute madness. So what we do is we'd set up a 30 frame per second timeline in Premiere, load in our footage. It would repeat every 4th frame. Like if you went through frame by frame, it'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. But then when you played it back out, it would run through this like $10,000 black magic box, which would go, okay, I can see the fields, I know what's going on here, and it would transcode it over into a proper 24 frames per second. However, that means sitting on my end, I have just footage that's repeating every 4th frame. And we asked the experts, like, okay, well, I'm compositing on top of this, what should I do with this? And they were like, just work with it like normal, the box will take care of it. And I was like, yeah, except this is 24 frames per second in a 60i wrapper, and in order to match the footage, I'd be dropping 30 frame per second CG on top of it. There's no way 30 frame per second footage could gel with the rest. They're different cadences. And they said, don't worry about it. The box can handle it. And after doing approximately 800 visual effects shots, we discovered that no, the box could not handle it at all. And I had to redo many shots. Meanwhile, DSLRs and red cameras are a thing, and people can just like do that now, but I'm still like battling this old format. Anyways, that's why everything jitters and stutters so much. I think this is also like a weird export. And just to wrap this up, on the chance that any of you happen to go back in time 15 years and have the same problem I did, what you want to do, I finally found out, you right-click, go Interpret Footage, Main, make sure the frame rate is set to 24, or 23,976 probably back then. Change the fields to, I forget which one, and click Guess 3 to Pull Down, and it'll actually conform the footage from the 30 frame per second field thing into 24 frames per second, correctly, de-interpolating the different fields. So that is Project London, and it's still, I think, floating around in random incarnations if you ever feel like hunting it down. Again, I wrote it and directed it when I was 18, and you watch it and you go, yes, that makes sense. This man's sense of irony is not yet fully developed, but that leads us on to the next instance of compositing Josh Truax into a cockpit. Dynamo, episode 3, filmed back in 2011. We did a whole bunch of shooting before I went off to Amsterdam to make Tears of Steel, and I was kind of editing this in the evenings, and then, after I came home from working on Tears of Steel. And because we didn't have like an actual cockpit for this, I was able to design the composite to match more what I wanted, which was a very, very shallow depth of field. So I was saying that like everybody could shoot on these DSLRs now, and that meant for the first time like indie people could shoot with a shallow depth of field that we all thought looked so cinematic, and so everyone was keeping things as shallow as possible, filming on their 50 millimeter 1.8s, and so this was very exciting and just kind of in line with that aesthetic. Actually, I remember looking at everything that was being uploaded to YouTube at that time, and again, everything was so shallow, but none of those lenses had optical stabilization, and everybody's hand holding, so everything's jittering all over. And I was sitting at my friend's sports bar once with like the 12 TVs, and all of them were having like optical flares doing stuff for like different truck logos and things. And I had this moment of realization, like, oh, this is going to be what 2010 look. This is going to be the aesthetic of 2010, and probably in the future, like the big high budget flex is going to be keeping everything nice and wide, deep depth of field, just showing you all of the budget, which I think has kind of happened, and I actually enjoy it. That's really what I'm trying to do with the scene I'm working on now, because I can upload 4K stuff to YouTube, and people do have big screens. I'm trying to really take advantage of the screen real estate. There's different types of kind of cinematic languages. Like if you're doing a lot of cuts showing different close-ups, you're kind of being like, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. But there's kind of an advantage to just keeping the camera wide as if it's another person standing in the corner of the room and just watching the character do things there. I feel like it's just kind of like staying out of the way and being like, hey, check this out over there, which I think can actually kind of help immersion more than like a lot of close-ups and edits. And so I've really been enjoying doing that. I used to shoot everything on a 50 millimeter lens, which is pretty long, and now I'm using my friend Andy Dabrowski's 18 millimeter lens, which is much wider. And a lot of my CG renders, I'm even pushing it to like 12, which is very wide, and also switching it to render a panoramic, so it kind of gives a little bit of that fisheye thing. Just CG so squared off that the fact that like all of the straight lines now are kind of curved, I think that's fun. But you can see here I've got the Josh layer, just a static green screen element. I filmed with a tripod and a chair and this background layer and some random bokehs. This is actually some footage, these foreground twinkling lights are some footage I filmed of a radio tower that I just tinted blue and screened on top to make it look like we're filming through glass or something. Again, just always trying to sandwich it in. And I'm actually pretty happy with how non-flat it feels. Like, all of this is just flat renders just stacked together, kind of like a photo collage, and then I'm tying it all together with a little bit of camera shake. But it doesn't feel too bad, except for this bit right here, where you can see I'm shaking the foreground bits a little bit too much. And I did always enjoy this this docking scene where the ship comes in and docks at Shade Tower, because I was kind of trying to make it reminiscent of that docking scene in 2001 where the ship has to line up with that spinning space station, and there's kind of the whole that ballet sense. And I wanted to kind of give the impression that he is just one person integrated into this technological kind of like self-running system, and I think that came across okay, and it looked kind of cool for 2012. And the next one, oh, this is my favorite dissolve I've ever done. This scene is more of the same, just kind of a little bit of camera shake to make it all feel alive. Although, to make him match the environment, I darkened him quite a bit, and he just felt very kind of Photoshoppy. It felt like I was doing too much post lighting, and what I had to do was reestablish the dynamic range of the footage by putting this highlight back into his eye. And just adding that one little highlight established that, like, no, I didn't just crunch all the values, it's just, he just happens to be dark. I don't know, it really, that's what makes the whole composite work. I actually got to hang out with Josh all day yesterday. We watched the Multiverse of Madness, which was fun. I love working with Josh, and I love filming his face. It's not like too movie star, but it's really transformative. It just, I don't know, he looks great. And then we made a bunch of different commercials with Imagos Films. We're doing a bunch of different like game commercials. And the usual thing was like taking a 2D game and then making like this crazy live action kind of commercial for it, which was fun. Did a few of those for Adult Swim. This one was called Super Motherload. I didn't do much on this one. Another important aspect is the fact that like the cockpit is so small that ideally everything should be affecting everything else, like lighting-wise. So when I was doing this scene with Rowan, I added a red cube, I think, here, just to bounce some of this redness back into the environment. And I actually rendered out two versions of the cockpit, one with sunlight and the other without sunlight, and I had an offset version of this layer here controlling the alpha channel of the sunlit version. It's I don't know, it's kind of a hacky compositing thing, but it worked okay in this one. But in general, even as far back as Project London, I was adding in blocking geometry that would kind of line up with the footage in 3D space, and it would exist, it wouldn't be visible to the camera, it would only be casting shadow on the rest of the environment, which helped a lot with integration. Something I always did with Josh when he was playing the Sterling character is, and sorry, I'm trying to figure out this microphone. I think I was blowing it out a little bit. Ideally, in the long run, we'll have better audio. But yeah, I always like to keep him centered in the frame, have really like kind of deliberate, contrived compositions where he's the focal point. He's this kind of powerful character who's very by the book, and I like to represent that with kind of the cinematic choices. In the scene I'm working on now, he's been burned a little bit, and he's like lost his mojo, and so I just have him kind of placed naturally into the scene. But eventually he kind of gets it back, and he's like, oh, and so we shift back into that centralized cinematography, and I don't know. Okay, and I don't want to do a full tutorial because I've already done that, and it takes forever, but I will do a rundown of kind of what my current workflow is. And I've actually been trying to go back to how I used to composite, where I would render out the background in Blender, bring that into After Effects or Fusion or Compositor, and then just layer the green screen thing on there and make the shot in the composite. And so that was me trying to do that here. It's kind of a preview render, but... And honestly, this works so poorly that I kind of realized right off the bat that I didn't want to try to tweak this until it worked. I wanted to just bring everything into 3D. So I exported an EXR sequence with an alpha channel of Josh, and I brought that into the Blender scene. So yeah, imported him as a plane, and kind of put him the right size and location in the scene, and just right off the bat, everything was working just a lot better. Like I have this subtle emission haze, which is the last video I uploaded, talking about how to make quick kind of rendering volumetrics. And just it all played so nice, and I was able to animate the camera a little bit, so I ended up with this shot here, which just feels so much more integrated from like the black levels and the camera motion and the depth of field and everything, and it feels more alive, and it feels like we're in the scene there with him. to a degree which I almost feel is a crutch. Like, I feel like if I were really going hard, I should be able to sell a locked off shot instead of just always having the camera there to help me out. But yeah, let's talk more in depth about how I'd go about that. Look at this. The scene is almost 10 minutes. That's very exciting. And I think I mentioned recently that I made the switch from working mostly in Adobe to Resolve in Fusion, which has been really cool because, one, the standard version is free, and so there isn't that $60 a month barrier of entry. But also, Resolve is a lot more color-oriented, and so it's been really fun playing around with all the different color settings and color options. They have all these masking tools and stuff that have been really interesting. But also, right here in the timeline, I can just right-click and say Open in Fusion, and that brings us into the compositor, and I can just start doing effects right here on the clip, kind of just straight from the timeline, which is interesting. It's node-based as opposed to After Effects, but if you're used to a Blender workflow, then a node compositor is probably fairly intuitive. This is just the clip coming in, this is the clip coming out, and anything we do in the middle is the effects that happen to the clip. So if I hit, like, let's see, select this one and hit Control Space, we can add a delta keyer right after it, and that lets us select some green, yes, and I can go to the masking tools and just start tracing around here. Dun, dun, dun. Really standard stuff. And that mask appears as this polygon here, and one of these gray triangles, yeah, garbage matte. So I'll drag this into the garbage matte, and I'm going to invert it and maybe soften it a little bit. And there we go, we got a key of Josh here. I might go back into the keyer and just kind of tweak some of these matte settings. They got a threshold here, which clean things up. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff you can do. The setup I usually use looks more like this, but I don't even know what most of this is doing, really. I just followed a great tutorial, which I'll try to link below, that kind of talks about how to clean up the alpha edges. But you don't even need this, because this key is already looking pretty darn good. Here, if we change replace mode to hard color, that cleans up some of that weird kind of like fuzziness on it. And yeah, let's export this. So I'll go here, hit I to set the in point, and go to the last frame and hit O to set the out point. This is the export tab. Then I get to set the file name, Sips Coffee Cockpit, change the folder, change the format to EXR. I'm going to make the codec a half DWAA, so it's compressed but not particularly lossy, and make sure I check export alpha, add to the render queue, and render. All right, let's hop into Blender. Here we are, going to hit F3, images as planes, go to Sips Coffee Cockpit, select all of these, say this is an animated image sequence, emission, and use alpha set to pre-multiplied. And now if we import this, and look at that, we got a little Josh floating here. And look at him, he looks so bored, but he also looks too bright. And that's because Blender fairly reasonably assumes that any EXRs you're importing are going to be encoded in a linear color space, because like EXRs are often used for VFX work, and there's no reason to not encode something in a linear color space if you're saving it into an EXR format. But Resolve will encode whatever color space you're working in into that format, so you have to tell Blender that in the shader editor. Here's the video file, and we just say the color space is not linear, it's sRGB, and suddenly he actually looks a lot more realistic. And we can always mess with this, like if we go color, mix RGB here and change this to multiply, we can change this value here to be like, I don't know, 5. And now we can slide this around and we can make him, a lot brighter if we want to. In this case, this actually looks fairly natural to me. I'm going to keep this shot organized by giving it its own folder. You can see I've got so many different shots, and it's a whole mess. But Sips Coffee, and I will put that folder into the cockpit folder here, and all of these other ones have different orange lights to kind of justify. You can see there's an orange light hitting him here, and I want that in the cockpit, but I kind of want different settings for every single shot, and so each shot has its own version of this. I'm going to duplicate it here, hit M to move it to the Sips Coffee shot, and I'll turn off this other folder, and there we go. Now I'm just copying this other one, and that just helps integrate everything quite a bit more. So if we wanted to, we could just eyeball all of this, like try to make him about the right scale here in the cockpit, and just put the camera roughly the right distance, like that, and that actually looks pretty good. And if we unhide all of our different haze layers, that kind of helps integrate it a little bit too. Actually, I think I want to make him even like standing right under the light, so I'll scale him up a little bit more, scoot him backwards, and yeah, now he's kind of in that haze ball a little bit. You can see if I turn it off, it's just some haze going on up there. And I like this because it actually gives me some room to kind of move around, and I can actually try to find an interesting composition. Like, it's fairly low poly, but I like having this foreground module kind of framing it. Like, there's this foreground module here, and then there's this other kind of like foreground cockpit bit, and there's this other bit that kind of wraps around. And I don't know, it's kind of just an interesting composition framing him still as like the subject of importance. But because he's actually in the scene, I could also keep moving back and actually look right through the glass and just kind of render my shot like this, which would be kind of an interesting option. I'd want to probably turn down the glossiness of the window a little bit. This would take forever. Although I like that you can see the reflection of what he's looking at right there in the window. I mean, it could be really fun to just have the camera drifting away from him slowly out of the cockpit. In general, you want to have the digital camera be about the same distance as the practical one was from the subject, because we can actually kind of tell if that's off, even if it's like out of context. Like, if you take a picture of somebody's face from really close up, their nose will be relatively closer to the camera than like the back of their head, and so they'll get a larger nose relative to the rest of their face. Whereas if you step back a few hundred feet and zoom in, suddenly their nose isn't, you know, ratio-wise that much closer than the back of their head, and so their face looks a lot flatter by comparison. And that translates into the scene. If you shot somebody up close and you scoot the camera way back, then like just the perspective can feel a little bit wrong. In this case though, we do actually have quite a bit of leeway, but probably what I would do is here, I'm going to add a camera. Just to start off with, I'm going to give it the same settings my actual camera had, 18mm and a 25mm sensor. And so, yeah, now if I put this about the same distance we had from Josh on the green screen stage, it should look right. But also we could change this to be like whatever we want. We could change perspective to panoramic. Yeah, look at that. And suddenly we have Josh in this fisheye thing. And I kind of like that for this scene. There's certain things I'll kind of let myself overdo for just like one scene, and it'll be like, yeah, you know, it's the scene where we use way too much CG fisheye, and it's like I wouldn't do it forever, but within this like one compartment, I'll kind of let myself go a little bit nuts. So yeah, I think I might actually stick with this. The last thing I would do to this, again, I can add my own camera motion here, and as long as it doesn't play with stuff too much, like it'll just kind of keep working. So I might add a subtle pullback here, like add a keyframe here. Let's see, how long is this shot? The texture says it has 180 frames, so I'm actually going to put that into the camera's name. So every time I click on the camera, I can know how long the shot is. So this will be Sips Coffee Cockpit, 180 frames. So anytime I select that camera, I can just change this to 180. It's just the thing I'm doing because I have so many different shots going on in the same file that it kind of helps me, you know, if I'm jumping back and doing a re-render, which I do fairly frequently. Then I can go to frame 80 here. Back up the camera just a tad, not too much. I'm not trying to be like crazy. Hit I, add another location keyframe. I'm going to open up the graph editor here, and you can see right now it kind of eases into and out of the motion. So kind of the camera goes, whoa! I actually can't just play the animation and show you because there's so much going on. Like I get, you know, like one frame every 3 seconds. But if I hit V here, vector, now the camera will be moving at a linear speed the entire time. In fact, I might have it start a little bit slower and speed up over the course of the shot. Just, I don't know. No, I won't. And the last thing I'll do is I'm going to use the Camera Shakify add-on that Nathan Vegdahl and I made and just add in a little bit of the wedding camera shake just to make it feel, again, a little bit more natural. And let's see, what else do I do? Oh, depth of field. Yes. And just jumping all over the place. Like this foreground stuff, I've never seen that in the shot before, and so there's nothing really here. This is just the back of a lot of other models. So before I do the final render, I would give this little corner a little bit of love and maybe try to actually add a more interesting texture here, because it just kind of looks like an extruded piece of geometry, because it is. But yeah, I'll check depth of field and maybe open the aperture way up. I'm going a little bit shallower with the depth of field than I normally would. And if the camera's moving too much, I would actually add an empty like on his face and use that as the focus object. But in this case, I'm just going to set it somewhere near here. So I just make I open the aperture as wide as it goes and play with the distance until he seems like he's in focus here. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And I also love, again, like I can play with depth of field and all of that, and motion blur and all of that, just for free, because he's actually there in the scene. But that also means when I close the aperture back up, he'll be nice and crisp, and everything else, he'll be centered right there in the depth of field, and I can just dial it in what I want for the rest of the scene. But that's the basic gist. People keep asking me about my compositing workflow, and basically I'm just doing the key before I bring him into Blender, and then afterwards I'm just maybe adding a little bit of glow and diffusion or grain over the top. But in general, what I get out of Blender is what I'm using as the final shot. Although I will point out, because I feel like I should point it out every time, the reason this works as well as it does is because I have the digital lighting matching the practical lighting. Like I had a big softbox over here on set and an orange LED bar over here, and I've kind of replicated that here in the digital environment, even though it's kind of... I don't even have an orange light over here to justify all of this light. I just have it to match his arm. Actually, it'd be fun to have kind of like an old-timey lamp or something hanging here. I don't know. That's just me. I like sticking old-timey lamps in sci-fi. But my brain's going a little bit. You can probably tell. I'll pick this back up tomorrow when maybe I'll have a finished shot. And the next morning, here's the finished shot. I added a whole bunch of new, just gobbledygook stuff in the foreground to kind of fill up that space. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. But yeah, hopefully there was something kind of interesting in this video for you. Sorry I went on a weird interlacing rant in the middle there. But I have a few other videos I'm hoping to get up real soon here. Nathan Vegdahl made this crazy compositing tool that I've been dragging my heels making a video for because I want to do it right. But now it's been like a month. I should figure that out. I will talk to you soon. Have a good one. Thanks for hanging out.